The White Man's Burden, Violence, Progress, the Unconscious Agents of History, and Golra Railway Station Museum. To speak of European colonialism is to enter a field of moral ruins. The charges are well known. Destroyed civilizations in the Americas, Aboriginal peoples held in cages in Australia, the transatlantic slave trade, the hanging of Mughal royal families. No honest account can deny these. And yet, as Hegel observed in his lectures on the philosophy of history, world history is a slaughter bench upon which the happiness of peoples, the wisdom of states, and the virtues of individuals are sacrificed for the realization of reason in history. Hegel did not celebrate this. He described it. The question colonialism forces upon us is not whether suffering occurred, it did, massively, but whether the final reckoning of historical progress can be written in blood alone, and whether the agent of that progress bears a burden that is both real and irredeemable. Europeans were products of their age, the restless spirit of post-Renaissance Europe, born of the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and a peculiar fusion of curiosity, commerce, and conquest, propelled them across oceans. They took with them steam engines, telegraphs, constitutions, and philosophies of liberty. They also took chains, gunpowder, and smallpox. The two travelled in the same ships. This is the uncomfortable core of the matter. Loot and plunder and the spread of civilization went hand in hand. Kipling and Tennyson, who sang the glories of empire, were in some ways correct, though not for the reasons they thought. The white man's burden, however racist its original formulation, was carried mostly unconsciously. Europeans brought democracy, constitutions, and liberal ideas to distant shores, even as they subjugated and extracted. 2. The transit of Venus and the measure of unevenness. Consider the voyage of Captain James Cook. In 1769, Cook sailed to the South Pacific on the HMS Endeavour with a mission that was as much scientific as it was imperial. The Royal Society had dispatched him to observe the transit of Venus, the rare passage of the planet across the face of the Sun, a phenomenon that would allow astronomers to calculate the distance between the Earth and the Sun, and thereby to measure the scale of the solar system itself. This was pure science, universal knowledge, the fruit of the European Enlightenment. The same voyage, however, also carried instructions from the Admiralty to claim possession of unknown lands for the British Crown. When Cook reached the eastern coast of Australia in 1770, he encountered Aboriginal peoples who had lived on that continent for over 60,000 years. They possessed sophisticated oral traditions, deep ecological knowledge, complex kinship systems, and remarkable art. But measured by the criteria of material and technological development, metallurgy, writing, agriculture, architecture, shipbuilding, firearms, they were living in what Europeans called the Stone Age. Meanwhile, Europeans had already passed through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and stood at the threshold of the Industrial Revolution. This is not a statement of racial superiority. It is a statement of historical and geographical contingency. Civilizations develop at different rates due to 1,000 accidents: geography, climate, domesticable animals, trade routes, disease environments. The transit of Venus expedition encapsulates the entire colonial paradox in a single image: the telescope and the musket on the same ship. The same Europeans who measured the heavens encountered peoples who had not yet developed the wheel. The gap was not a matter of centuries, but of millennia. This unevenness is not unique to Europe. Consider the Arab travellers of the Abbasid Caliphate, the golden age of Islam, when Baghdad was the intellectual capital of the world. When these travellers journeyed north to the lands of the Vikings and the Scandinavian tribes, they described what they saw as savagery. No writing, no cities, no law, no science, a life of brute force and pagan ritual. The Arab observer, standing in a civilization with algebra, medicine, astronomy, and a legal system of immense sophistication, looked upon the Norse and saw a people centuries behind. That was not racism, it was observation. The point is simply this: human history is not a single synchronous march. Different peoples at different times have occupied vastly different levels of intellectual, technological, and social development. The European colonialism of the last 500 years is only the most recent and most consequential instance of a perennial human condition. The encounter between the ahead and the behind, and the violent, uneven, transformative collision that follows. 3. The philosophy of history. Hegel and the cunning of reason. Here we must descend into genuine philosophical depth. Hegel's central insight in the philosophy of history is what he called the cunning of reason. List der Vernunft. Individuals and nations act out of particular passions: greed, ambition, fear, glory. They pursue their own narrow interests. Yet, through the totality of these actions, something larger unfolds: the progressive realization of freedom and self-consciousness in world history. The agent does not intend the grand outcome. The grand outcome uses the agent. European colonial powers did not sail to India or Africa to spread democracy. They sailed for spices, gold, strategic ports, and later for rubber, oil, and tea. Yet by accident and necessity, they introduced English common law, the telegraph, railways, the steam engine, modern medicine, and the English language itself, which became the medium through which colonized peoples would eventually demand their own liberation. Gandhi read John Stuart Mill in London. Jinnah trained as a barrister at Lincoln's Inn. The sword that cuts the empire is forged in the empire's own foundries. That is the cunning of reason. But Hegel also teaches us that freedom cannot be given as a gift. It must be achieved, internalized, lived. A constitution written on paper is not yet a living constitution. Law must be internalized. Democracy requires not merely voting booths, but centuries of accumulated habit, trust, and the slow sedimentation of civil society. Europe did not arrive at its own democratic institutions by decree. It arrived through the Reformation, the English Civil War, the French Revolution, the Reform Acts, and 2 world wars. A bloody, uneven, centuries-long process of learning through suffering. 4. The failure of imitation and the local fault. This brings us to the fate of post-colonial democracies. When European powers relinquished control after the Second World War, newly independent nations received the forms of Western democracy without the long, painful internal history that made those forms work in Europe. Constitutions failed, military coups arrived, dictators seized power. Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, military regimes in Pakistan and Myanmar, corrupt kleptocracies across Africa and Asia. These were not simply the continuation of colonial exploitation. They were local failures. The truth is hard. The colonized peoples were given material structures, railways, telegraphs, schools, parliaments, but they could not be given the centuries of intellectual and moral development that Europe had undergone. That development must be lived, suffered, and learned from personally and collectively. No one can inherit wisdom. No nation can borrow conscience. The steam engine can be shipped. The scientific method can be taught in a generation. But the internalization of law, the habit of toleration, the willingness to accept electoral defeat, the slow building of trust across tribes and regions, these take time, centuries of time. When they are absent, democracy becomes a pale shadow, a foreign garment that does not fit. Contrast this with the late decolonizations. South Africa, which achieved majority rule only in 1994, has stood relatively well. Why? Not because colonialism was kinder there, It was brutal, but because the struggle against apartheid was long, internal, and forged a degree of national agreement and institutional resilience before power was transferred. Similarly, nations that had longer periods of internal self-governance under colonial tutelage, or that underwent their own Meiji-style revolutions, fared better. Japan, never fully colonized, looked at the West, chose to import science and technology deliberately, and, within decades, defeated Russia. Not with swords and shields, but with modern weapons. The difference was not race, it was historical agency. 5. The Kabul airport, the paradox made visible. Now we arrive at the most vivid image of the entire paradox. In August 2021, as the United States withdrew its forces from Afghanistan after 20 years of war, scenes emerged from Kabul airport that the world will not soon forget. Thousands of Afghans, young men, former soldiers, interpreters, clerks, ran alongside American military aircraft as they taxied on the runway. Some clung to the landing gear, falling to their deaths in the sky. Others crowded onto cargo planes beyond any reasonable capacity. The desperation was total. The image was this: the withdrawing power, the defeated empire, the retreating army, and the local population chasing it, begging not to be left behind. Let us sit with this for a moment. If Genghis Khan invaded Afghanistan today, would the Afghans ride horses alongside his army back to Mongolia? Of course not. They would flee in the opposite direction. The difference is everything. However terrible the American presence was, and we are told of great atrocities, of drone strikes, of civilian deaths, of Abu Ghraib and Bagram, the Afghans themselves, in their final desperate act of the war, chose the Americans over what came after. They chose the flawed, violent, intrusive modern power over the alternative. The Taliban, the return of a medieval order. To understand the full measure of the paradox, we must compare Afghanistan before the American invasion with Afghanistan after it, and also with what came in between. You can try your search engine for pictures of Afghanistan before and after American occupation. Afghanistan lagged behind the rest of the world for another reason. Unlike India or Pakistan, which had centuries of exposure to modern state structures, education, and infrastructure under British rule, Afghanistan remained largely untouched by colonialism. It made very little progress on its own. The country had no railway network to speak of. Its educational system was minimal. Its economy was pre-industrial. Then came the Soviet invasion of 1979. The Russians came not to build, but to prop up a failing communist regime. What followed was a decade of brutal warfare, scorched earth tactics, helicopter gunships, mass bombings of villages, millions of landmines sown across the countryside. Over 1 million Afghans died. Millions more fled to Pakistan and Iran. The Soviets left in 1989, leaving behind a landscape of ruins, a generation of orphaned children who knew only war, and a country littered with unexploded ordnance. Then came the Civil War. From 1992 to 1996, the Mujahideen factions, victorious over the Soviets, turned on each other. Kabul was shelled to pieces. The already destroyed infrastructure was further pulverized. Libraries burned. Museums were looted. The city of Kabul, once called the Paris of Central Asia, became a wasteland of crumbling buildings and severed corpses. Then the Taliban arrived in 1996. They brought order of a kind. The country was not rebuilt, it was frozen. Then the Americans came in 2001. Let us be honest about the motive. They came to destroy Al-Qaeda and punish the Taliban for harboring Osama bin Laden after 9/11. That was their stated aim. They were not missionaries of democracy, they were not philanthropists, but in the process of securing their military objectives, they rebuilt. They built roads that connected provinces for the first time. They built hospitals. They created a parliament and a constitution. They brought the telephone and the internet to a country that had neither. They educated an entire generation of young Afghans. They did all this imperfectly, corruptly, wastefully, with drone strikes that killed civilians, with hubris and incompetence, with contractors who stole billions. But they did it. And this is the great irony of our age. The same America became the place where Afghans desperately wanted to reach. A crowd chased its planes. That difference is the entire history of the modern world compressed into a single image. 6. The reckoning. Migration and the return of the repressed colonialism has ended. The flags have been lowered. But history does not close its accounts so easily. Today, a strange and terrible reversal is underway. People from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, descendants of those who were colonized, are fleeing in vast numbers toward the very nations that once colonized them. They arrive by questionable means, across the Mediterranean, in rubber boats, through the Balkans on foot, hidden in trucks. They are not fleeing toward the past, they are fleeing toward a modern world that the West built. This is the reckoning. The West spent centuries extracting wealth and reshaping the globe in its own image. It preached democracy and hoarded its benefits. It brought telegraphs and railways, but drew borders that guaranteed future civil wars. Now the descendants of the colonized are coming to the metropole itself. They are coming to London, Paris, Berlin, Rome. They are coming not as conquerors, but as supplicants. Yet their sheer numbers, their different religions, their different memories of history, unsettle everything. The white man's burden, once carried outward, has returned home. 7. Conclusion. Terrible truth and mountaintop vision. Let us then sum up from the mountaintop, having eradicated personal likes and dislikes as best we can. European colonialism was cruel. That is undeniable. But this is not a critical remark about Europeans. It is simply how humans have lived through history. Peoples with no contact with one another developed at different rates. When they met, the more advanced, whether Abbasid Arabs encountering Scandinavian tribes or Europeans encountering Aboriginal Australians, did not wait. The transit of Venus and the Stone Age on the same voyage, the telescope and the musket in the same hold. That is not a moral failing unique to Europe. It is the human condition, rendered visible. The modern world is a creation of the West, for better or worse. It is stamped in the West's image, science, the nation-state, industrial capital, human rights language, even the critiques of colonialism themselves. The fact which is irrefutable is that without the colonial encounter, the steam engine, the telegraph, and the modern structures of state would have arrived in much of the world centuries later, if at all. That is not an apology for the hanging of Mughal princes or the cages of Australia. It is a statement of historical causation, the electrifying touch. Golra Station. Last winter, on a bright sunny day, I went to the British-built Golra Railway Station Museum on the outskirts of Islamabad with my great friends Gayoor Hussain, Tariq Abbasi and Nasir. There, preserved, stood steam engines and bogies, locomotives from the British era. I reached out and touched one with my own hands, and in that moment, something happened. An electrifying sensation ran through me, not a physical shock, but a sudden, overwhelming connection with the forces of history. I was touching not just metal, but an entire epoch. This machine had once thundered across the subcontinent, carrying passengers, mail, soldiers, and the invisible weight of an empire. And I, a man born decades after the British left, was standing where that history had passed. In that instant, a strange question arrived unbidden. If the British had never come to the subcontinent, how many centuries might it have taken for us to conceive of a steam engine on our own? Today, Europeans feel apologetic. They have learned a lesson at great cost. But in their contrition, Many now disavow any positive contribution of colonialism. That too is an error, born of guilt, not understanding. The white man's burden was carried, mostly unconsciously, but carried nonetheless. Kipling's phrase, stripped of its racial arrogance, points to a real historical phenomenon. One civilization, at a particular moment in time, possessed a disproportionate share of the world's technological, scientific, and organizational power. And that civilization spread those things, violently, unevenly, selfishly, across the globe. The final truth is terrible. History does not apologize. It does not balance its ledgers. The same forces that brought the railway and the telegraph also brought the cage and the whip. The same nations that gave the world democracy and human rights also gave it the slave trade and the concentration camp. And now, at the end of the colonial era, the descendants of the colonized are arriving on the shores of the colonizers. That is not justice. That is not revenge. That is simply history continuing to happen, indifferent to our moral categories, the slaughter bench still turning. We study Hegel not to excuse cruelty, but to understand why cruelty and progress have been, so far, inseparable. Whether a different path is possible for the future, whether humanity can learn to spread its achievements without repeating its horrors, is not a question for the philosophy of history. It is a question for action, for will, for the choices we make when we touch a rusted steam engine at Golra station. Remember both the rails and the chains, and decide what to pass on to the generation that comes after us.